Thank you very much, and welcome all of you to yet another episode of Baithak, organized by Center for Civil Society. Thank you very much to all of you for coming on Monday evening to spend time with us talking about deciphering Gandhi. And we have two very important people who have been talking about Gandhi at multiple occasions in multiple ways and format. And every time I get to interact with them, it happens to be another learning episode for me. And therefore, we thought, why not to do a formal Baithak where we also record and bring it for everyone, this interesting conversation. And the two people we have is one, Mr. Gurcharan Das ji, who is who has had a prominent established career in corporate sector, and then he turned to writing books, and he has written multiple of those. And two of my favorites happens to be the first one, which was India Unbound, and the second one, the difficulties of being good. And both of those are written in completely two different contexts. One is about economy, and the second one takes ideas from Mahabharats and religious texts and talking about values and what makes people good and how difficult it is to be a good person. And the second person is who I will call an independent thinker and philosopher and a guide and mentor, Barun Mitra, who was also the founder of Liberty Institute. And he has been actually I would say, luxury of time to spend qualitative time thinking deeply on some of the issues and some of the aspects of multiple ideas that we work on. And certainly, we do take a lot of source and inspiration from Gandhi. The format of this discussion would be that first I would allow both of our speakers to kind of talk about, for 5 minutes each, about Gandhi's, what I'll call, let's say, Barun's Gandhi and Gurcharan's Gandhi in their own ways. Because these days, everyone is kind of interpreting Gandhi in their own manner and whims and fancy and their own framework, which some of us may like or may not like. So I would like to get two different versions of Gandhi in this 5 minutes. And then I would encourage a kind of a free flowing conversation between both the people. So there should be a discussion and a question answer. And I will also jump in between wherever I think that I possibly need to play the devil's advocate role and create more excitement and interesting conversation. And last roughly 20-30 minutes would keep for the audience if you have some interesting questions. Then we would try to engage as many as possible. So to begin with that, why not to start with you, Barun, who basically was the ideator of this Baithak.
Thanks, Amit. And thanks, Gurcharanji, for joining us today. And I am an engineer by my education. And Gandhi was in the periphery of my thinking for much of my life. Not that I didn't know, most Indians cannot but know about Gandhi. But it was at the periphery. But last 10 years, 15 years now, I found suddenly that I'm being forced to look into Gandhi, and for one very practical reason, as an engineer, that he was approaching society and his own life as an engineering experiment. It's not a coincidence that his autobiography is my experiments with truth. And therefore my interest was, and I'll tell you a short story, how I really thought that there is a challenge. As Amit said, I was one of the guys who set up Liberty Institute for 2025, and Mr. Das here was one of the first person I published from that 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago. But in the since 2010, perhaps, if we want a cutoff, more or less, I was thinking of a challenge that we are discussing policy. CCS and many others are discussing public policy. But our success rate or our ability to actually influence or shape policy has been marginal, to say the least, to non-existent. Therefore, the question was, what is it that we are lacking? And then I came across, I knew these people as my friends since the 1990s, but I came to know their work, the ARCH. ARCH is an NGO in Gujarat. CCS also knows them pretty well. And I knew them from the 90s, so they were not a surprise. But in around 2006, 7, 8, they engaged on a very interesting practical project that followed the land rights for the tribals. A law had been enacted, and they advocated for it successfully, and then they were trying to implement the law. It's one of the rare occasions when an organization who was involved from the design of the law to actually try to implement it at the end. I came to know them, closely during this period, because this was an issue of land rights, and therefore to me, an issue of property rights, which most of us in this room and at CCS is one of the core tenets of our whole structure, of our whole thinking. What I found, during these 5 years from 2010 to 2014-15, I had a very unusual experience of visiting many, remote villages, really deprived and poor, poverty-stricken. The kind of poverty I had not seen in India since my childhood days of 1960s, 70s. But what struck me, and this is the question, my first dilemma, because I'm very interested in that word that you are using, that in none of these, in these 5 years of extensively going around with my friends in ARCH to villages from Odisha to Gujarat, through the central tribal belt, never once did we have to discuss the intellectual or historical merit of the idea of property and land rights. And that started bugging me. That here in Delhi, we have done so many seminars and conferences where we have to debate whether this is a right, whether this right is necessary, how is the evolution of the right, the whole intellectual framework of the idea that is property or land. But there in the countryside, in some of the poorest, most illiterate places in India, we never had to discuss. So I was wondering that is this something that we missed? And then I began to realize that these people don't need to discuss it intellectually because it's their lived experience. And that attracted me to Gandhi. That every attempt that he made in his own life and in his public life, they were all about lived experiences. His ashrams, his larger campaigns, they were all about lived experiences and therefore the ability to connect. It was not an intellectual exercise. So that, because I was involved in policy, public policy for all these years, this began to really strike me that here is something that I might have missed in all these years of advocacy, advocating about ideas of liberty and freedom, because we failed to tap into the lived experience to which people can relate. We were in the intellectual domain, which is why I began, and maybe I'll stop here, that I began looking at Gandhi as an engineer. That you are living through, you are experimenting, you are trying things out, you are modifying, you are growing, and here was a man who attempted to grow till the last day of his life. So that is how I related my own, engineering is about solving problems and keep tinkering, making incremental improvements wherever possible. That he was actually doing it and doing it at a scale that we cannot even imagine. So that is how was my first, attraction as a historically living person in India, not too far behind in the last 70, he was alive 70 years ago. That here is something that we could probably learn from, that what he did, his experiments, and whether we in the public policy realm could pick something up from these experiments. So that could be my opening. Thank you.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you very much, Barun. And in that case, this is the benefit of these conversations. So today I got Engineer Gandhi. Uh, and basically, you talked about, with your ARCH experience, the difference between intellectual exercise and lived experiences when it comes to talking about ideas. Forget influencing or shaping public policy, just talking about ideas. And Gandhi's mastery of doing this, not just only for himself, but at a scale, and then he could possibly communicate with like millions of people. Now coming to Gurcharan, yours Gandhi.
Well, he's talked about the engineer Gandhi. Let me begin by speaking about the classical liberal Gandhi. Now, we are at the home of classical liberalism here at CCS, and I see that face staring at me in that picture of Gandhi. So I think it's very appropriate that we ask ourselves what sort of a liberal was Gandhi. And to be very honest, liberalism came to India in the 18th and 19th century on the coattails of the British Raj. Of course, we should forget that they were preaching liberalism while practicing illiberalism in their colonial rule. However, the thing that's striking about the early liberals, because they had a very good response, that the liberal Indians took to liberalism, like ducks in water. And you have this guy, Ramon Roy, one of the first persons at that time, who is talking about liberalism, but slowly he's also Indianizing it. He's adding a spin to it. And similarly, you had, after Ramon Roy, other people in the 19th century who spoke about, who were liberals. Vivekananda came later. And originally, the Indian liberals were concerned with, from the very beginning actually, with the deficiencies of the human being, of the Indian. And they were, for example, sati. They used liberalism as a weapon to fight the very illiberal institution of sati. And so coming to Gandhi, that's what is very striking, that like the Indian liberals, Aurobindo, Vivekananda and others, he added his own spin to liberalism. And which was the spin in the notion of Swaraj. By the way, I recommend, if there's one book you want to read, Barun talked about the story of my experiments with truth, which was his autobiography. But I would say this is the other book, Hind Swaraj, would be the other book I would read. These are, if you read these two, you don't need to read much more. There's far too much to read about Gandhi. Anyway, the spin that Gandhi put on to the notion of to a basically Western ideal, which was born amongst philosophers in the 18th century, the spin that he added was the notion of inner freedom. So it's not just outer freedom that we want. We want to have our self-government for ourselves. He kept reminding Indians that first we have to be deserving of that freedom. And that meant first self-rule, meaning rule yourself. And he saw saw the human being as a collection of passions and emotions and so on, and one had to imbibe the notion of satya and ahimsa, which were two central ideas in his thinking, and he brought them and made Indians believe that we have to achieve that inner freedom to attain the outer freedom from the British. And I thought that that's a very, very interesting idea. And if you want to explore it further, there's a book by Dennis Dalton, who was a professor at Columbia University, called, I think it's either called Indian Liberals or something about I think it's called Indian liberals. And he's analyzing all the Indian liberals of the 19th century and how it all converges to the notion of inner freedom, which of course is very central. We all know from the Upanishads, the Indian concern. The Indian civilization is unique in this respect. If the Western civilization is about the human being and the world, man and the world, conquering technology and all that. That's the great contribution, science. And if the Eastern civilization, meaning China, Japan, their genius is expressed in the relationship of a human being with another human being. That's why Japanese have 34 ways to wrap a present. Indian civilization is about man and himself, the human being with himself or herself. So it's that inner. So it's very consistent with our own civilization. And the reality, of course, is that thanks to I was at, you told a story, so let me tell another story. I was invited by the Egyptians during Arab Spring in 2011. And one of the questions they asked me, this is at Tahrir Square, they asked me was, how did you keep the generals out of power? Now, most countries that became free after the Second World War, they succumbed, including our neighbors, Pakistan, etc., succumbed to a rule by generals, meaning army coups. And so this was on top of their mind because Mubarak was ruling Egypt. And anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that my answer to them was, I'm not sure whether it was luck that we had in India, whether it is luck or what it is, but there's another conversation going back there, and I'll just wait for you to finish your conversation. So, my point is, look, India was blessed that we were born in the shadows of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, created by saints. And our chief saint was Gandhi. And nobody in the world had achieved independence without shedding an ounce of blood. We just tired them out. The British just got tired and left one day in August 1947. And so it was such, and frankly, even our generals who took over our armies, they were in awe of this. Our neighbor Pakistan had 10 governments in the first 10 years, and then a general, Ayub Khan, took over. So this was the story of most emerging countries. And so I would say that, and the tragedy is, I think Gandhi died too soon after independence, because the fact is that Gandhi was unique in being able to capture the minds and hearts of the masses of India, because he was able to translate the ideas of liberalism, liberty, equality, in the language of dharma. And after he died, there was no one. We should have sold our constitution as a dharma shastra. In fact, the great Sanskrit scholar P.V. Kane, he got a Bharat Ratna when Radhakrishnan was the president. I think in the 60s he got his Bharat Ratna. And he had called the constitution a Dharma Shastra. This is how Gandhi also referred to it. Now, because we never sold the constitution in the language of the people, even today, the average person you go, the Aam Aadmi in the village, thinks of the constitution as something that fell from the sky one day, and it's not ours, because nobody has sold it. And for me, as a person who spent his childhood in America, in my school, they would sell the Constitution every day, you know? And that is something that, I mean, Nehru tried, but he was too much of a Western-oriented gentleman to reach the people with the language of the people. And so to me, when I think of Gandhi, and frankly today, the rise of Hindutva and the rise of this present government is partly because no one sold the language of the Constitution. The opposition keeps screaming, oh, they bring Constitution to the Parliament every day to remind the ruling party. But have they ever tried to sell the Constitution to the people? So my point is, the rise of Hindutva is partly a resentment of the people, one against the elite, especially the English-speaking elite in the country. And the reality is today, at best 15% of Indians are comfortable in English. And yet, almost all the serious business of the country, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector or the government, it's done in English. Imagine if in this gathering today, a young man walked in who did not understand English. That person, a bright young lad, that person would think he's deaf. And imagine feeling deaf in your own country. Now you understand the reason for the rise of Hindutva. One of these has to be the fact that we haven't really reached out and touched the Aam Aadmi with the institutions that we created in 1947. Well, listen, I could go on and on, but let me stop there with a few of these thoughts for you. When there's time, I would also talk to you about partition, because I'm a child of the partition. And I went through that experience, and Gandhi played a role. But we can wait until our discussion begins.
You have anything to?
Well, a few things I can say, but if you have some immediate thoughts, why not?
One is, just to pick on the last one, because to me that's the contemporary one. The history, I think in a way you probably contradicted yourself, because you said the Indians were introduced to liberal values and ideas through the colonial venture in India. At the same time, you went back to trace it to the Upanishad and
Yeah.
others. I'll not get into that part of the debate discussion
It's
now.
not a contradiction. It's a spin, I said, that Indians added to the Western ideal of liberalism that the British introduced to India in the 18th and 19th century.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if when we use the word spin, it generally comes with a kind of a connotation that we are designing something. This gets me to the other point because I don't really want to get into the history at this stage, the cultural history. I'm more interested in the present, and therefore my interest in Gandhi began. And what you ended with, which is I think is a very interesting point, and we must discuss that further, is that when you said selling the constitution as a dharma shastra, where on the other hand, I began by saying in my initial statement that it's a lived experience. Gandhi didn't sell anything. He was trying to relate it to people's lived experience because the values are being lived on a daily basis. Which is why he was so insistent till his last days that a village republic is what will save India. Because a village republic is not republics of independent villages. A village republic is, as he conceptualized, including in Hind Swaraj, I think, is a community where the culture of politics is imagined and reimagined and revived on a daily basis. In every transaction, economic and cultural, in families and beyond. Every transaction, every interaction is an opportunity to reimagine politics and therefore revive the values that is going to underscore it. Which he could connect. Because he lived through it. His ashrams to me were a direct experiments. Because he was, in his time, the most urbanized person, that we can think of. He grew up in a well-off household. His father was a diwan. He went to England in 1880s, which is not many of us know family members who would have gone there in 1880s to UK. Became a barrister and was an extremely successful barrister as a practicing lawyer in South Africa. Most of the time staying in cities, in urban areas, or his ashrams were just at the outskirts of the then urban centers. So what he was able to cultivate was experiments he was doing in establishing a relationship, and which I think is a very interesting point. I hope we can get a chance to discuss that. Because this is also the cultural thing which you drew between the Far East, China, Japan, and India. I'll give you an example. Let me do an workshop example just now. As a personal experiment, and the reason why I got attracted to coming for this discussion and proposing to Mr. Das that we should do it, because I'm really keen as an experiment. The experiment is, I am very keen to listen and try to understand the perspective that Gurcharan is bringing to the table. I'm really very keen. I'm trying to digest as much as possible, and I know I asked Kumar that I would like the audio tape because I want to get this. Because, why am I doing it? I am not interested in debating him or scoring points or winning or losing that debate. I am listening to myself and I'm thinking in my head as to, do I understand what he's saying? Am I getting his perspective right? Forget whether I agree or not. And then begin to see that from his perspective, can I have an explanation integrating my perspective to his? So it's an experiment. I'm thinking in my own mind. And to me, this was Gandhi's essence of politics. He was thinking within, and that thought within, he was applying as experiments outside.
And in fact, he was creating, all leaders create mythology. almost all leaders are and it's like the nation. The nation is a fiction.
Yeah. Imagine
The
community.
best definition of the nation was given by a man called Benedict Anderson.
A Marxist.
And he called a nation an imagined community. And leaders of of a nation also create an imagined narrative. So what he calls these experiments are the lived experiences of what Gandhi is doing. That is part of the mythology that he's building up. And part of that mythology was the genius of it lay that he could reach because of the language that he was using, the language of Sadharan Dharma that he was using. He was able to reach to the people. In fact, I think this is important because this government is also trying to create a mythology. You know, it's as much a mythology, a fiction, as anybody else. And what I find, unfortunately, is the fact that we've lost so many years. I mean, I had hoped Jai Prakash Narayan, who had finally come, and Indira Gandhi got very worried about him, and she put him in jail. Well, I thought he would be the one to create that alternative mythology, that dialogue with the Aam Aadmi. And so, the reason why I call the constitution, Gandhi actually called it a Dharma Shastra once, because he believed that he was creating new habits of the heart. Classical liberalism is becoming in India new habits of the heart by referring to the constitution as a Dharma Shastra. And it's a moral document. And that's why all his language is clothed in the language of ethics, of doing the right
Can I just
thing.
make a remark on this point?
Yes, sure.
Dharma, as he saw it, and I think that's probably a more right translation than religion, is righteousness. His second book, How to Be Good. How to know what's the right thing to do. And the reason why there's a distinction and a relationship between morality and law, because Constitution as a textual document, most of us in the last 200 years would see it as primarily a legal document, a philosophy of law governing the society or the country. Gandhi didn't really count much on the formal institutional structure that a constitution might design. He didn't. He didn't because he was much more concerned that unless we can, what you said at the end, cultivate it as lived experiments in our daily life.
Habits of the heart.
Habits of the heart. We will never be able to sustain it. No country has ever been able to do it. The imaginations will only divert us into other things. The reimagination is necessary on a daily basis.
And so actually, Barun, to me, why Gandhi is relevant to us today is that we are in a period in the world of hyper-nationalism again. And I thought we had gotten over it. I thought the Second World War had closed the chapter after the damage that Hitler did to the word nationalism. I thought nobody will dare come back to that word again. But you can see everywhere, but also in India, that we have constantly this talk about people who are nationalistic and who are anti-nationalistic. And so I think it's useful. It's useful to think of Gandhi Because after all, the freedom movement that Gandhi led was a nationalist movement. And so we grew up until the Second World War and the fascists took over. We grew up all believing that nationalism is a good thing. But somewhere in the 30s, we saw the rise of fascism, 1930s. We saw the rise of fascism in Europe. And the 19th century idea of nationalism came out, and it upset the whole apple cart. And by the time that liberalism defeated fascism in the Second World War, um, the that that narrow nationalism of the 19th century had been discredited. So why I mention this now, and why I mention the mythologies that we create, because nationalism is also creating mythologies of our past and how great we were in the wonder that was India and all that is there. It's good for liberals, since you yeah, let's just take a short. Yeah, okay, I think it's working. All right.
Please tell.
Sure. Please sit down. Okay, let him go to the outside and then we'll restart. All right. George Orwell wrote a very fine essay after in the end of the Second World War, where he made a distinction between good and bad nationalism. Now, Gandhi and Nehru and our freedom movement was a good nationalism. And Gandhi ensured with ahimsa, etc., that it remained good, because he made a distinction between means and ends always, that good ends required good means, and ahimsa and so on. What we see today is a lot of bad nationalism. And that bad nationalism, first of all, begins with the idea that we are a nation because, one, we are an ancient people. We are a pure people of some kind. And so that kind of nationalism requires either a common language or a common religion or a common ethnicity, a race, common race. And this is why it's good to remember that a nation is an imagined community. It's a fiction. And the only reason why you and I should consent, the word of consent is very important in our constitution, that we should consent to live in this community is not because we know the same language, not because we are the same religion or the same we had the same ancestors, because we are making a choice to live in this community, and this choice is usually often based on what opportunities it gives us for jobs, for education, for health, and so on. And so Orwell was just pointing out, because the good nationalism is the nationalism, for example, that brought me back home to India. When I could have lived anywhere in the world, I came home because I remembered my grandmother telling me, for example, the stories from the Mahabharata. And those were the heroes we had grown up with. Of course, the difference is she actually believed they were our ancestors. And I certainly wasn't going to believe that. But nevertheless, the point is the memories of childhood, the geography, the rivers that we used to, the mountains. We lived in Shimla as a child, and I still remember the Himalayas. And those are the Indian cricket team. We used to cheer the Indian cricket team, which we still do. So those are, according to Orwell, that's good nationalism. Bad nationalism is about power. It's about our country being superior to other countries. And it is about a nationalism that basically your circle of concern stops at the boundary, the border of your country. And what are borders of our country? Borders, in our case, and in many cases of countries of the the borders are the one second. There's a thank you. Sorry, I get interrupted. So what I'm saying is, borders are scornful lines drawn on a map by a bureaucrat, a scornful bureaucrat, and they deserve the contempt that we should heap on them. Instead of borders becoming bloody lines in a battle. And so our concern as human beings should always rise beyond the horizon of our borders. Anyway, I'm laboring this point because we are living in this hyper-nationalist age, and this bothers me. I thought we had one of the lessons. I was a child of that time who grew up. I was born in the middle of the Second World War. And the lesson we had learned from people like Gandhi was the lesson of the evils of nationalism.
I think one good comparison would be, and big debate in the 1920s was between Gandhi and Tagore on the issue of nationalism. It's worth reading. But let me go back a little on the question of borders. Where is the border? Is it where the bureaucrats have drawn the line? Or is it where we have imagined it in our own mind? And let me give you an example, another part of my thought experiment. How often do we engage with ourselves? Meaning, why I wanted to have Gurcharanji here and have Amit here to have this discussion. Because I wanted to see whether I'm unable to do what I ought to be able to do. That is, think through, because he's been prolific in public life, he's written a lot, to be able to think from his perspective. And therefore, in my own mind, if I have any idea, the first question would be, why am I for it? That's why I have that idea. The immediate after would be, what's the arguments against it? Am I able to engage in a discussion with myself on an idea and scrutinize my own beliefs to the best of my ability? That's the first line of border, the imagined community. We are unable to imagine ourselves, look at ourselves in the mirror. We look at ourselves in the mirror, but we don't see. We just see the front and, brush our hair, or in my case, my beard. And that's about it. Are we able to imagine a conversation with ourselves? Not to confirm what we hold dear, but to scrutinize what we hold dear. Gandhi, and I'm sure you would know about this, used something called the inner voice, the little voice inside. What was that voice? People thought he was dreaming or he was communicating with God. And somebody recently said, I'm sent by God. No. He was desperately trying to communicate with himself. To hear his own voice arguing on the same issue from both sides. That is how we dissolve the border in our own mind. And if we are able to do that, we dissolve the border with others in the community and across the society, across the country, and beyond the countries. That's why the nation is an imagined community. It's our capacity to think. And I'll just make two more points because you mentioned it a little earlier. We all know Gandhi to be for, Satyagraha, and ahimsa, non-violence. Why? Have we asked ourselves why? Was it because he was born in a Vaishnav family, which to a large extent are vegetarian, non-violent? I mean, after all, Hitler was vegetarian and was not really known for non-violence, although he may not have killed anybody personally. Why are these two terminologies, words, satya, truth, and non-violence, so critical? I believe this is critical in order to think. First, to think that our idea is not the only idea. The reason I want to listen to him. Because I really want to force myself to try to see, can I look at it from a different perspective? And which means that I know the limitation, or at least I'm trying to acknowledge the limitation of my own understanding. If I know the truth, I have it, right? Which is what most religion has come down to, or most politics has come down to. We claim the truth. We know this is our truth, and we go to war for it. Not a coincidence. If we search for the truth, which is why the experiments with truth. If we search for the truth, that means we have to pre-acknowledge that our truth is not complete. And therefore an interaction gives us an opportunity.
And so, I just want to...
But let me finish that non-violence part.
Yeah.
Yeah, just one
ahead,
thing. So that is truth. And we can magnify it socially. Politics is about discovering a shared truth at any particular point in time, so that you can move forward. The second point is non-violence. Why is it necessary? Just look at it. Look at the logic of it. And he had an extremely acutely logical mind. I'm amazed at how logical he was, although he was not a theoretician. He was a very practical person. The logic was, if I am going to claim my truth, then I'm going to enforce it. And if I have to enforce it, violence would be inevitable. Because you and he may not agree. But I have the truth, and therefore I have to enforce, because I have the truth. I really believe I have the truth. And therefore I'll go to war, or engage into violence. Truth and non-violence, as I have begun to realize in the last 5-7 years, as Gandhi saw it, was two sides of the same coin. Truth is a quest, and therefore non-violence. Because I want to listen. I don't want to throw him out just because his truth is maybe different at this point in time with mine. I want to listen. And let me end with just this example from his own life. I'm amazed. In South Africa, there was a General Smuts. He was the Governor General of South Africa during much of Gandhi's time. Sent Gandhi to jail for 3 or 4 years. Not at one go, but repeated goes to prison. General Smuts in 1914, when Gandhi and his family were leaving South Africa, gave a famous line, that we are glad that we are getting rid of the Mahatma. Because he had acquired that halo and he thought that, it's off my hand now, let the British handle him. In 1939, on Gandhi's 70th birthday, Radhakrishnan, whom you mentioned, compiled a very interesting book from world leaders, many people, writing something about their experience or understanding of Gandhi to mark the 70th anniversary of Gandhi, birth anniversary. General Smuts wrote a letter. And I'm amazed at how somebody did it like that. He said in that letter, and it's available on the internet, you can see that. Gandhi, when he left South Africa, made a gift to General Smuts. a pair of slippers, leather slippers, that Gandhi had made while he was in prison in South Africa. And he gave it as a gift, that something I made in your prison for you to remember me. General Smarts returned that leather slipper 30 years later, saying that I have worn these slippers for many summers, but I no longer see myself fit or worthy to walk on your shoes or on your steps. And he returned that letter. The reason I'm saying this is because 30 years ago, General Smuts and Gandhi were facing each other for 10 or 15 of their lives in South Africa, all the time. Yet 30 years later, this is how General Smuts remembered Gandhi. And this is exactly what the Britishers in England, when they were sending the civil service from England to work in India, at least much of the time, till the later time the Indians became civil servants as well, but still predominantly it was British. They were warning the British civil servants being trained in England to come to India as part of their imperial service. That don't get too close to Gandhi, he's going to win you over. To me, this is non-violence and truth in action. There was no enemy. There was literally no enemy. Therefore, no violence. And there was an acknowledgement that there was a possibility that my truth is incomplete, and therefore listen, and therefore non-violence. I'm amazed how he got this, figured it out so comprehensively, and then put it into practice. To me, that last bit, that putting into practice, is something I'm really grappling and struggling to understand. That how, all of us have our ideas. We have all read either science or principles or philosophy or moral values, law, but we struggle, as in your second book, how to put it into practice.
Well, there are, while you were speaking, I was thinking that there are misconceptions about ahimsa and Gandhi, and some of these critics have a very good point. And one of the sort of classic criticisms is that if India had been ruled by Nazi Germany and rather than the British, whatever their deficiency may have been, that they had grown up in the classical liberal tradition, the British, even as rulers. And if Hitler had been in charge, do you think Gandhi's message of Satyagraha, his technique of non-violent protest, would have had anywhere, or the first Nazi would have shot him immediately, and that would be the end of the whole thing? And I mention this because, in fact, this is it's a very prevalent criticism of Gandhi, because it is based on the belief that Gandhi believed in turning the other cheek. And the prudent ruler of a modern state, he recognizes the need for a police, for domestic security. He feels the need for an army for external security. And these are elements of violence, of force. And even Yudhishthir in the Mahabharata faces this problem, because the early Yudhishthir, when Draupadi asked Yudhishthir in the forest, she said to him that, look, let's go back. I mean, our kingdom has been stolen from us by this wretched fellow, a cousin of ours, Duryodhana, and let's collect our army and get our kingdom back. And Yudhishthir's answer to her was, but I've given my word. And she's thinking, this man's a bit crazy. That Draupadi's thinking that he's trusting Duryodhan's word, and she's trusting that this is, in other words, turn the other cheek is the other, the sort of Christian answer to Yudhishthira's character. And in fact, it's interesting, by the way, because I studied the Mahabharata. I also know that the Mahabharata was influenced by the Buddha. Most of us don't realize it, but Yudhishthira's character in particular was influenced, the Himsa part of it, of his character, is influenced by the Buddha. Anyway, the point I was trying to make here is that the ahimsa of Gandhi was never, I don't think Gandhi would have agreed to disband the police or disband the army, which is what Yudhishthira is saying at the end of the war. When the war is over, and the Pandavas have won, Yudhishthira wants to renounce the throne. You all remember. And in Shanti Parva, it's Bhishma who convinces him that, look, your job is now to rule, and don't just go off in the Himalayas like a yogi. Your job is here, and your job means that you have to have an army, you have to have a monopoly of force, basically. And Gandhi was influenced by all this, because ultimately, just as Yudhishthira ultimately had to press the button to declare war, all this time, when Draupadi is saying that, look, let's get our kingdom back, he says, no. He realizes finally that the Duryodhana is not going to give back their kingdom, and they have to declare a war. So what I'm trying to say is that this notion that Gandhi's turned the other cheek, this criticism, is not entirely valid, because Gandhi was a very prudent man. He was not just a saint. Of course, he renounced ruling the country, and he did not want to be a member of the Congress party afterwards. However, the fact is that this notion of, since we're talking about ahimsa and violence, Gandhi had a very deep suspicion. That's why I call him a classical liberal. He has a very deep suspicion of the state, of state power. And he wanted that state power to be used sparingly and within the bounds of what we call the rule of law. Those are not his words, but those would be the words of a classical liberal. And this is a good time to remember all this, because we have seen in the last few years, state power being misused in our country.
I think there's just one famous, I was actually really surprised when I first read it, that Gandhi actually says that every action of the state, that is every action of the state, is a manifestation of violence. You know what you just said? Because it's backed or it's covered under the umbrella of law. Because whatever it does is under the law. It is, in a way, the law. That's how it was for much of human civilization. The ruler was the law. And that's how it is in many parts of the world, including ours, over the last 70 years, increasingly so. Now the issue is, and this is to me going back to a point I said earlier, the lived experience part, the village republics, where his answer to a centralized dominance of monopoly of force, that we will not be able to break it. No country has been able to break it. The state has marched on, classical liberalism or no liberalism. Over the last 200 years, 250 years, the scope and capacity of the state to expand has simply grown and grown and grown. Today, just look at it. There cannot be a single action of ours that is not covered by the state in one form or the other, from our birth to our death, from the birth certificate to the death certificate. Every action is under the scope of the state. Can we really claim that we are carrying the legacy of people like Gandhi who criticized the state completely and give a very practical answer, which is why he didn't bother so much about the constitutional framework, because the constitutional framework will fall if the cultural framework that is necessary to sustain it through practice is destroyed. Therefore, and to me, something is only in the last 4-5 years that I'm really beginning to question myself on the issue where he ended, rule of law. We spent our whole lifetime thinking of public policy, make it more towards freedom, more towards prosperity, more towards this, that, and the other. Some things that all of us would agree. What we forget is that everything we propose is legitimizing the growth of the state. If liberalization happened in 1991 in India, it legitimized the state. The state did it. If it is being reversed today, as many of us believe, and the state is coming back in a way we cannot even imagine, it's the state that is doing it. Which is why the only point that I think we really need probably another day to discuss is what you said. Because this is a very standard point, and today is the first anniversary of the war in Gaza, October 7th. Gandhi in 1938 wrote a small essay, just 2 pages, just titled The Jews. And he questioned so fundamentally the very basis of creating a state on the basis of a Zionist Jewish identity. The othering. You know what I said, that our inability to discuss? Because we cannot discuss within our mind. The boundaries have already been drawn. And he warned in 1938, 10 years before Israel was born. Israel happened in 48. He warned that you will have an unsolvable problem. And look at the difference. I'd been to Israel once. I'd been to Pakistan and Bangladesh once each. Look at the difference. When I went to Israel 15 years ago, I was surprised that in an office like this, where there are Palestinians and Jews, me as a visitor, everyone, we all sat down to have lunch together, tiffin together during the break. The Jews and the Palestinians would hardly ever talk to each other. They would talk to themselves or talk to me. But never, I was shocked because it was such an experience that had no relationship in my mind. After that, I visited Pakistan and Bangladesh. I was amazed that whatever may have been the difference at the political, institutional level, foreign policy, the warmth that we as Indians visiting these 2 countries receive is to be experienced in order to believe. There's no word for it. Why has it happened? We also partitioned, they also partitioned in Israel. Yet, the civilizational bond remains here to an extent that has virtually disappeared there. And Gandhi warned. Exactly the same reason why Gandhi opposed partition here. That you draw a boundary, it will be very difficult for you to break through because it will reinforce the boundaries in our mind.
So, therefore, really, we come back to the old question that just as the boundaries of Israel were created by bureaucratic pens, so was the boundary between Pakistan and India. And both those boundaries still bleed in the hearts of human beings. And so this is, it's very easy to blame the British because they were the ones who carved
On
these,
both sides, here and there.
in both there in Israel also and here as well. The blame is not to create the boundaries, but is to go further and ask the question. One, in the case of Pakistan, it was Jinnah who led the demand for a Muslim state. And the demand was an old one. It started in the 19th century, and only Jinnah was the latest. And the basis was religion, that we Muslims cannot be ruled by others, and therefore we deserve our own state. That was the, and if you ask yourself today, look at Pakistan, which was created on the basis of religion, and where it is today, and look at India. And we are also not perfect by any means, but there's clearly Asman Zameen ka farak. That so one thing, I remember I mentioned this rotten 19th century idea of nationalism, which is that a nation is based on a common religion or a common language or a common culture. Rubbish. It's an imagined community. And when you look at yourself in the mirror, the way he was recommending us to look ourselves in the mirror, once in a while, we should ask ourselves, when we look ourselves, am I Indian? What does it mean? Am I, what, how, looking yourself in the, talking, that silent voice of Gandhi, talking to yourself. We are always talking to ourselves. Self-talk is part of our being, reflexive consciousness of the human being. And so, anyway, the blame also that we can put on the British much more than finally drawing the line. It was not the British who wanted India's partition. It was Jinnah. It was a Muslim League that wanted it. And now they have realized they are part of the great Muslim countries to the west of India. And how many of those countries today who were, they very proudly felt was the basis for a state, how many of those would you call successful states? Almost zero. So that is one, but where violence, we talked about violence, and this is where Gandhi, I was reminded of Gandhi because I was 5 years old and in Lahore when the partition took place. And I still remember as a child, and it's now a more recent memory because I've written my memoir and I describe what was going on in our home at that time. And the reality is that on 15th of August, independence was declared. And on 17th of August, they announced that Lahore was going, that there would be two countries and Lahore would go to Pakistan. And suddenly the next day, the barbers of Lahore, who were madly busy because they were cutting the hair of all the Sikhs who didn't want to be identified as Sikhs by the people of Muslim. Already the Muslim League and their sort of soldiers, I call them, but they were informal militia. These people were beginning, the violence had already begun in a few days' time. And so Sikhs were the most visible, and they were going to the barbers to get their hair cut so they can at least show at the border or on the way to the border that they are not Sikhs. The point about the partition, and Gandhi has a very important role to play here, was that it was how does one explain that millions of people living together for hundreds of years, that was the condition in Lahore and in Punjab
And in Bengal.
and in Bengal. And how is it that these people suddenly went insane and began to engage in violent acts? I think it's the people who blame the British, nobody could have predicted it. But one thing the British could have done is their great rule of law and order, which they prized, they could have made their departure a little more orderly. By orderly, I mean they could have made sure that the army and the police did not completely leave right away. And so, and of course, Jinnah, as you know, Mountbatten um, did leave faster than he had to. In other words, he was given till 48, June 48 was the date given.
Advanced.
And he advanced it to be a hero of some kind. To whom, one doesn't know. But he had advanced it, and he thought he was doing a favor, frankly, to... Anyway, my point, just to say, I mean, I'm going to come back to Gandhi, but I myself saw at the railway station. We came through with lives intact, with only the clothes on our back. We crossed the border in Amritsar, Wagha. Then we had to take a train to where we were going in India, and we were at Jalandhar station waiting for the train. We had got into the compartment, and those days trains were running not on any particular time, and there was a policeman, very handsome, tall policeman, guarding the peace. And I'm 5, I'm looking out the window of this compartment, and 2 Sikh boys, teenagers, they come with kirpans and they stab the policeman in the back, and he falls down, and there's blood covering the image after that for me. And they shout Musalman. The policeman was a Muslim. And so I asked my mother, what happened here? And she could not give an answer. And she also didn't understand how these 2 strangers, just because he is Muslim, these 2 strangers are going and killing him like that. And so the best explanation I can think of is temporary insanity. That when human beings become temporarily insane, that's an abnormal experience. But when groups become insane, that's the norm. And ever since then, groups and religious groups I've been personally wary of. And this is where I want to bring Gandhi, because he, with his moral force, Satyagraha, he trudged the villages during that period of East Bengal, of East Pakistan. And there was relative peace. And we all believe, and it could well be true, that it was Gandhi who the Bengal escaped that violence of Punjab.
I mean, Bengal didn't escape it. Bengal had it a year before. And it was Gandhi's last miracle. That he performed a miracle there, and this is where it was not, the moral force didn't come because he was a Mahatma or a saint. In fact, I would never refer to Gandhi as a Mahatma or a saint. Never put him on a pedestal. The key to understand Gandhi is to look at him as just an ordinary man who could attempt and had the audacity to imagine the extraordinary. If we put him on a pedestal, we excuse ourselves. What he did was actually put his own life on the line again in the last year of his life. So it didn't happen. Bengal saw tremendous violence in 1946. He spent 4 months in Noakhali, walking up and down the riot-torn Muslim areas of Bengal. An aunt of mine was there with him and with the group. It was incredible. He had no policeman. He simply said that I will be there, and if you want to kill me, kill me. He spent every night in a village which was predominantly Muslim, precisely to make the point that you want to kill me, come and kill me. That he was practicing what he was preaching. That's what I'm saying. Today, do you see anyone, civil society or a political leader or religious leader, entering a field of violence to challenge violence with non-violence? That's putting in practice. It is that which gave Gandhi the kind of authority that he had, and therefore 47, he spent a week or so in Calcutta, because Calcutta had been a very violent city, and many of us wouldn't know that Calcutta in the 1940s was a Muslim majority city. And in fact, I don't want to get into the partition issue further, but if you taking on what I said earlier about cultivating the habit of thinking within ourselves, scrutinizing ourselves, read or listen to the text and the analysis that comes from Pakistan and Bangladesh on partition, you will be surprised. You will be very surprised that it was not, Jinnah had a marginal role. There are Pakistani intellectuals as well as Bangladeshi intellectuals. Because of the recent events in Bangladesh, I've spent a surprising amount of time trying to understand Bangladesh. Just my neighbor on the east, because I'm from Bengal. Read or listen nowadays on YouTube, social media, wherever. Listen to anything you find credible and assess it yourself. Challenge yourself. You'll rediscover how to engage with yourself, and therefore how to engage with the others. Others, not just Pakistan and Bangladesh, others here. Which is why you probably noticed, I don't know if you did notice, Mr. Das, has used this word liberal or liberalism quite a few times this evening. I used it in an article in 2014, and I stopped using isms for Gandhi. 2 reasons. Gandhi claimed every ism that was on earth in his time. He had no problem, provided those isms could be interpreted on his 2 parameters, truth and non-violence.
And so Gandhi gave truth and non-violence, ahimsa and satya, were for him the preconditions for becoming worthy of true citizenship and to enjoy the fruits of citizenship.
But this ism thing, this is critical, because I myself, in fact, the last meeting, I think Amit probably was surprised when we did another Baithak, when I said that I no longer would like to call myself as a liberal or a libertarian or whatever. The moment we put an ism to our thinking, we are claiming the truth. And therefore, we are stopping ourselves from engaging with others. And the reason why Gandhi, it was impossible to label Gandhi politically or ideologically. The radicals thought he was a conservative, the conservatives thought he was a radical. And he was comfortable with any ism that one could lump at him. Because by breaking through the ism, we refuse to get identified, our identity gets identified with an ideology, and therefore the truth that ideology carries. Yeah. Never carry that. If we do that, we'll never be able to talk with ourselves. Because then we are only reinforcing. When we look at the mirror, we only reinforce our thinking. That we are libertarians. Therefore, everything that we think are libertarian. And therefore, there's a spiraling cycle. We'll never question ourselves. question
I wanted to get it out of this ism thing and just say just the last few words, because we started with Gandhi and the partition, that if you want to understand the partition, I don't think, frankly, we'll ever understand, because it was, as I said, it was temporary insanity, and temporary insanity is the norm amongst groups, especially religious groups. So the the, 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 the best thing I would recommend is a short story of Manto. Manto was a poet, and he wrote one story which is set in the lunatic asylum in near Lahore, and in that the lunatics, जो पागल हैं, the lunatics are arguing with each other. They are pretending that they are leaders. One becomes Gandhi, one becomes Jinnah, one becomes Nehru, and all are saying, and they are talking like leaders. And at the end of the story, you're left with the feeling that actually the only sane people in the world are the lunatics. That these people are trying to make sense. They're being Gandhi, Jinnah and all because they are literally trying to make fun of these leaders. And yet nobody understands. Anyway, I just want to say that to close the loop about religion not being a, a sensible basis for a nationhood, nor is language. And Bangladesh is the best example that how Bangladesh broke from West Punjab, West Pakistan. It was on language, that they wanted Bengali, and Jinnah refused to let them teach Bengali in their schools and colleges. And that was the seed that was. The same mistake was made by Sri Lanka when they lost a whole generation of they were like an ASEAN country, and suddenly look at what happened to Sri Lanka. It was a generation of Tamil tigers and all that. And so I'm just saying, even today, there are people who are trying to. We made many mistakes in India, but one mistake we have not made is to create a national language, or the government to impose a national language.
We tried, we couldn't.
Yeah. And let's hope, because there are still people harboring around the corner, they are harboring to make to declare a national language, because they think that's the basis of nationhood. So this is a good time to remember the insanity of human life, the absurdity, the idea that the nation is a fiction. And there's no such thing as language or religion or ethnicity that contributes to it. It's the only reason to live in India is if it gives you opportunities, if it gives you certain freedoms, if it gives you, now it's your turn to speak.
Thank you very much. It was such a organic, free-flowing conversation. I didn't want to disturb, but
We didn't let you.
Yeah, I didn't want to also come in because the conversation is happening so beautifully. But I know the time is actually forcing me, and as I promised, there are people who have traveled and came to listen to you. So certainly there are a few things that we want to talk, but also there are a few things that they want to ask. And therefore, I think it will be kind of injustice or violence from our side that we are not giving you the opportunity to ask the questions. So, if there is any question that we can take at least a couple of those one by one, and my request will be before asking question, you introduce yourself and then ask question. While okay, no, please for the recording purpose.
Thank you So much, CCS, for organizing this. Gurcharan ji, I had the opportunity to listen to you many years ago, maybe 10 years or so, when you were, I still have your signed copy of India Grows at Night book. During one such conversation, I remember you quoting the example of how you see Dharma, that it's the invisible hand of Dharma that runs a country like India, because with all the contradictions to all the chaos that India is. So, how do you see today we are in 2024 and the heated conversations around everything happening around Dharma, Sanatan Dharma? What would your definition of contemporarizing it to today's language? Because everybody is coming up in a different, language
I'm
that is
not sure
incompatible.
if your question is first clarifying what is dharma, and secondly where we are heading. The dharma is, I mean, dharma is a very frustrating word, frankly. It can mean anything. It can mean many things in different contexts. It can mean religion. It can mean law. It can mean duty. It can mean virtue. It can mean goodness. But essentially, the central idea is the idea of the human being trying to do the right thing. And and I think the people today who are talking about dharma all the time, they have no clue of what they are talking about. And of course, they are also creating a mythology. After all, it's all fiction. This statecraft and state history rewritten by us, by the state. So, as to where we are headed, very simple. I was one of the first persons to predict the rise of India in India Unbound. And this was around, the book came out in 2000. And India has obliged by rising. And it's, 6% growth over 30 years. That's pretty good for a democracy. But we haven't created the jobs that should have come. We didn't create an industrial revolution. That's for another day. We can talk about that. But India still grows at night when the government sleeps. And this is the lesson from what one of the points we've been making in this conversation is state power and the state. What Margaret Thatcher, when she did reforms in England, she reformed the state. Governance reform was as important what she did. We still have that unreformed bureaucracy, and we still have that corruption around us. Even China, Deng Xiaoping, most people don't know. He reformed the state while he brought economic reforms. So that, I'm afraid, is still true. That this is the big, for this Viksit Bharat notion, the more important thing to get to Viksit Bharat is not economic reform, but governance reform. Reform of the police, judiciary, bureaucracy, and parliament. I would say, very simply.
Just one line, if I may. Just one line.
Sure.
That the thrust on religion, put it more bluntly rather than dharma, because dharma, as you said, has all those connotations, and I go with the last one mostly. That is the struggle to be right. It's the struggle to discover what's the right thing. So the use of religion, and not just in India, the use of religion in politics is actually, in my mind, an illustration of how politics has failed us. And my takeaway from Gandhi was how to revive the essence of politics, which is through practice. Not through intellectual discourse, not through power, but through practice. That's why he was so much on experimentation till his last day. and to demonstrate and do those experiments in real life situations where his life was literally on the line. He got killed once, of course, but he had had 6 or 7 attempts in the last 15 years of his life. And in South Africa, he was beaten twice almost to death. He was putting his life on the line. He was experimenting, he was trying to struggle to find the ways to discover himself and therefore communicate. That is politics. Politics, that's why, get out, we need to get out of the label business. Politics is not about Congress, BJP, or it's not about capitalism, socialism, liberalism, whatever. Those are all imaginations of politics, imaginary construct of politics. We have to rediscover the essence of politics. Then this issue of history, rewriting history book or using religion, whether Christianity or Islam or Hinduism for a particular political project will disappear. Our problem is that we have surrendered politics to all these other things because we don't have any conception of politics except an attempt to grab power. Politics has become synonymous with power. And in fact, what we did here for the 1.5 hours is politics. We were discussing, we were trying to think, we were trying to negotiate, we were trying to raise points and respond to those points. It was not party politics. It was not power politics. I came precisely because I was really interested to understand from where he's coming, because we were on the same page 25 years ago. So we need to do that. We need to rethink politics.
Okay. Second question. Okay, we have 3 people raising hands, one by one. Yeah.
I am Nitesh from Center for Civil Society. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. I think I can listen to you for the rest of the night if the time permits and the energies. I have one question for each one of you, like one question each. Mr. Das, you have talked at so many different platforms about mentioning that Gandhi probably died too soon. So can you imagine an India in 2024 had Gandhi lived, let's say, 10, 12 years extra, and how different or similar India would have been? And a question for you, Barun, from an engineer to an engineer. If you had the opportunity, then what experiment would have you co-created with Gandhi?
Very interesting. Who would like to go?
Well, if Gandhi had lived longer, I think there might have been a break like brake in your car. It might have been a break on the socialist project, the 1956 resolution and the Mahalanobis plans, which led us into a command economy. I think Gandhi would have, when he saw that, he would have rebelled, and otherwise I made the point that Gandhi, we needed somebody to sell our wonderful constitution to the people, and I think Gandhi would have kept that. What essentially the ideas of our constitution that Ambedkar scripted down were ideas that were shared by that whole first generation of the people. But nobody quite understood as well as Gandhi that we needed to sell it to the people. It's like the mistake we have made now. Nobody has sold the reforms to the people. That's why people still believe that the reforms make the rich richer and the poor poorer. Nobody has sold the market to the people. And that's why that's why Rahul Gandhi makes this easy trade-off every day between growth and equity. This false trade-off,
Barun?
Sorry. The co-creation would be, what I've been struggling for the last few years and now in this last 1.5 hours is how do we experiment in a way that is not a laboratory fiction in the sense that it is in a limited, where the boundaries or parameters are very rigidly set, but experiment in a way that Gandhi attempted. His experiments were not in a laboratory testing setup, including the ones he tried in his ashram. Those were his laboratories. The key point to remember is that the test is not in the outcome. Gandhi was not testing his outcome. He was testing his methodology. Did Gandhi know how and when salt Andolan would work? He didn't. He was not even interested. But that salt movement created the first time a pan-India political identity. That was an experiment. He knew how he's going to attempt it. He didn't know what's the outcome. What we get trapped, particularly us like engineers, is we have the end in mind and then try to design everything in order to achieve that end. And we fail spectacularly. Gandhi was, like Mr. Das said a while ago, the means, the method, the process. The end will come if at all it does, because we have no control. But it's the means. It's the means that made Gandhi what he could do, because he was not looking for the ends.
Next. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Saurabh. I want to get both your views on something which is a bit of a mental block for me when I'm trying to understand or read about Gandhi. It's like this thought I have to suppress, so I keep reading him, which is tales of or experiences that people have narrated of his experiments with desire. So there are instances where he may have pushed a boundary. There could be instances where there may or may not have been consent, where someone else became a means to his own end in some sense. I'm not very sure, but there are narrations that he may have of his experiences with his partner or whoever chose to be with Gandhi in that larger collective. I don't know if you've had similar instances, and I would just love to get both your thoughts on this block.
Well, it's absolutely true, and it's good that you mention it, because we don't want to give the impression. I certainly don't want to give the impression that he was some kind of saint. He was a human being, and he was bothered by desire, and he was hoping to be able to overcome it. And he did do these experiments with his nieces. I think they were his nieces, and there's a rich literature by psychologists and historians about what he was doing. And clearly what you said correctly, that he was more concerned about whether he could control desire, but he showed no concern for those poor girls, his nieces, how they would react. So it is a dark spot. I mean, here was a man that we hold up there, but he was a human being who made mistakes, and this was one of his mistakes. That's the way I would think about it.
Next.
There's a fellow called Vinay. There's a political scientist or academic chap called Vinay Lal, I think.
Yes.
Who has written about these.
Historian.
He's a historian, perhaps, yeah.
Actually, take it literally. Gandhi kept writing about his experiments, not just this happened during the riots of Bengal, but his whole life. Much of what we know about Gandhi was because he was experimenting and was putting it in public domain to know, to the world, for the world. Otherwise, these experiments That's how it became known. I think the key point to me is what I've been saying repeatedly. He was an experimenter. And I see, like I did not come from social science, I'm an engineer by my education. Engineering is founded on experimentation. There won't be any engineering without experiments, right? He was experimenting, he was engineering, he was trying to see that, and granted the extent to which Gandhi may have secured consent, or because of his position, he might have secured consent when there was no consent. But as far as we know from everything that has been around, and Gandhi himself wrote about it, so that's how we know, that unlike anything in history, Gandhi's experiments was not to engage but for abstinence. It was not an experiment to see how virile he was. It was to see how impotent he was. So to me, that is at a different scale altogether. That we cannot imagine how that is. That he was not testing his virility, but the lack of it. And he was experimenting on himself. And this is a valid point, and many people have raised it, which you just said, that that the nieces were quite young. And given Gandhi's stature at that time, he would command, his wish would be their command, right? But if there was any impropriety between them, Gandhi would have been the first one to write, like he wrote about it from his, his autobiography and his whole life. He would be the first one to make it public, his own weaknesses. So to that extent, I think we need to look at it in the context in which it came. Because it created a huge furore within the Congress itself.
Okay, next question, please.
Hello, my name is Anshu. My question is to Barun sir. So you talked about politics as being a sort of, an understanding towards a collective truth. And I'm also a student of politics, and over the last year, I've been trying to understand what exactly politics is. And definitely, at least from the perspective of a textbook, it's essentially distribution of power and how you manage those things. And it might take me decades to actually understand politics, but what is this collective truth that you talk about? Is this towards a good life for a community that we're looking forward, and politics as a means to achieve that? Or what is this truth exactly that we're looking at when we talk about politics?
It is a means. Gandhi was all about the means. The ends hardly mattered. Ends, once you say that, okay, this is what you want to achieve, then you store it, file it, and forget it. The question is how, which is how I got attracted to Gandhi in the first place. Like in engineering, we can think of the grand machine. The question is not to imagine a grand machine. The question is, how are we going to actually achieve it? What would be the strategies and the tactics and the procedure? So Gandhi was all about means. And the reason he saw politics in that light, because the truth will change. The process through which you acquire it, and if that process has a social legitimacy through experiments where people travel along to learn from each other, to learn in a collective way, like it's an experiment, everyone participating learns. And Gandhi conducted social experiments at a scale we cannot even imagine. Even he couldn't have imagined. Did he know, for instance, when he began the Dandi March, what impact it will have? I don't think he knew. No one could have known. The British thought that, okay, this man wants to walk 200 miles, 250 miles, let him walk. What difference will it make? But it created the political identity of India. India had not seen, the people had not been able to imagine that this could be a political community of a collective of that magnitude. So I know stories where Gandhi was arrested. He was arrested very soon. People continued to make salt for months afterwards. Some people in Chittagong in Bangladesh now, they didn't even know that Gandhi was arrested, because in those days the news will travel very slowly. But they still continued to make, because it struck their imagination that here is a simple thing on the thousands of kilometers of coastline that we have, any one of us can make it. And make it as a symbol of defiance to the rule, the British rule. That is the imagination. That is how you connect. That is how you build an alternative narrative. This narrative is not to demonize the British. It is to underscore to yourself what you can do. Your own capacities. He reimagined the whole identity of India in that movement. Because India had all these provinces, all these princely states, whatever. No one really thought what would be a political identity or a shared identity of India. Salt created that. And his genius lay in choosing salt. Because he could see that it's something that connects every household. Something that the British or anybody else would imagine it to be so ordinary that it has no relevance. Gandhi's genius or his creativity lay in being able to imagine a way to make something so ordinary part of your life into something so extraordinary that for the first time British realized that this rule is going to be very difficult. Yeah.
Okay, let's have the final question, and then I'll keep 1-2 minutes for myself for my questions. Let's go.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Ibrahim Qureshi. First and foremost, I would like to extend my gratitude to CCS for letting me be a part of such an eye-opening debate. I'll give you one line why this is so important to me. As an NRI, we and a lot of my brothers and sisters who are Indians and live in foreign lands, lose our identity and our connection to the motherland and to our system of our beliefs and how we operate, and to our political system as well. So this is why this was really important to me to come and connect once again and see what is brewing in today's world and how we can apply it to basically better India for our kids, for our future. First and foremost, I would like to also share my sympathy with Mr. Das about his story of partition, as someone's family and friends who personally defined pretty much every border imaginable in this world. I completely understand, and I studied in middle school in a school of 21,000 NRI Indians, and I did my high school in a school dominated, an international school dominated by Pakistanis, 98% to one Indian. That was me. And I tell you, it was the best experience of my life. To the point when India won the World Cup against Pakistan, I walked with my chest out and my head high, even though I'm not a fan of cricket. But I never felt any discontent or threat of violence from those people, because they shared what you said, the bond of civilization with us. At the end of the day, they understood today's division was unity in the past. Well, my question to Mr. Das is very simple, and it's not a question, it's basically an ask for reprimand if my thoughts that I've noted down here are actually making some sense to intellectuals like you. You were talking about good nationalism. Well, what I could think and jot down in my notebook as a fellow engineer as well is, I think after listening to your conversation, both of you, good nationalism is just well applied liberalism. What do you think of it?
Well applied liberalism.
Yeah, well, both of those are words. Liberalism is a word and nationalism is a word. So it's you're trying to explain one in terms of the other. And I think that's not a very fruitful way to go about it. But you're right. I mean, if we just accept the fact that liberalism is about tolerance, about showing a degree of openness to ideas, of the ability to change your mind if you see evidence against it. It's about the rule of law, things like that. Yes, I think good nationalism would promote or would be happy in that circumstances. And the bad nationalism is about power, obsession with national superiority, and somewhere saying that, we are better. We are better. The word better. Not that we are good, but we are better. That's where the problem occurs with religions, with nations, and so on. And the nice thing with cricket is that one day you can be better, the next day you lose, and you're not any better. So that's nice, about sport. So that's really all, I can sort of contribute to your thinking. But instinctively, you know what I'm talking about, that good nationalism doesn't hurt others, basically.
Yeah, and I would, I have grown out of it. I'll no longer use the word ism because we use it as a flag to identify ourselves, and then it limits our horizon, our ability to think. So ism is not a good way to look at it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm reminded of we are running over time, but let me also use my veto power because I don't want to miss on this opportunity to ask this question, which actually goes with the flow. And for Barun, I have a question. You can be short in your answer. See, basically, you were talking about the lived experience of Gandhi, right? Now let's capitalize on your lived experience, and basis that, if there is one idea that you have to talk about it, right, based on your own lived experience, what would that be? That you can think you can follow the Gandhi's path and talk about it, and which may have brings, at least you see whether the scale comes of it or not, a solution comes of it or not, but this is one of my lived experience worth talking.
I thought I did that for the last 1.5 hours because I began with it.
Well,
I actually began with it.
Yeah.
If you remember what I began with was...
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So the distinction is I'm trying to think that if I am not to repeat what I already said at the beginning, but just in case, we have to figure out how rather than the what. Most of us, including me, CCS, Liberty Institute, we all came into this kind of work, public policy, for instance, in our case, trying to think that we know what we want to do, liberty, freedom, whatever, free market. The only question is, how do we advocate that? What I've realized in the last 10-15 years is that that's a wrong way to begin. And which is why I began, if you remember still, with my own story 15 years ago, when we were traveling through, with ARCH Vahini through central parts of tribal India. And why, that's a question that is still stuck in my head. That why is it that every time we do a seminar at India Habitat Center or IIC, we'll have to discuss the philosophy of property rights or the history of property rights, for instance, land rights. Whereas when we were in those villages, in the poorest parts of India, we never had to discuss that. The question is why? Why didn't we have to discuss it? That's the difference between lived experience and an intellectual exercise.
Sure.
Yeah, so I would say, so I came from the intellectual side, like most of us in this room. And we failed to link it to our own lived experiences. And therefore, like this sentence here, I noticed it from the beginning, conversation in policy. Actually, we never used this word policy on its own. We used it as public policy. But what we did was forget the public, as this has forgotten, and focus on the policy. Go back to the public, ourselves as public, and reimagine that what's our relationship with them. And therefore with us, because we are part of that public. So so this struck me when I first came in, and I'm glad that I'm making this at the end. that we have forgotten the public in the public policy. Either we take it so granted that we think it will automatically happen. So that to me is the issue to really to carry forward in anything that we do.
Perfect. And additionally, I think one key thing to take forward from this conversation is engaging in a conversation where there could be multiple truths. So it's not that you or Gurcharan has discovered the ultimate truth.
Yes.
This is what and we are trying to enforce, but we are all in our own experimentation and process of finding, and therefore we see value in such kind of conversation and engagement. That's one key thing to take forward. And this further connects with some of the questions and concerns. And one key thing, time and again highlighted about the nationalism and Hindutva based nationalism. And I'm sorry, but my own understanding, it may be coming or rising for some time being, but it would have its own shelf life. Why so? What gives me that strong confidence? That because we are talking about Hindutva nationalism, which is based on religion, and in that sense, Hindutva itself does not follow only one particular set of truth. Actually, it encourages you also to be a little more skeptical and try to find truth, right? It also, in some sense, encourages you to discover your sense of inquiry. And therefore, some people may accept it, Hindutva-based nationalism, as a truth for some time, but soon they might also get disillusioned, and therefore it will have a shelf life. Now, related to that question to you is Gurcharan. Let's say Gandhi died so soon, but today, if there is one policy issue that you think Gandhi would have loved to communicate with general audience in the language of dharma, which was his mastery. So any policy issue of today that you can think needs to be communicated to the audience in the language of dharma.
Well, I just said it a few minutes ago that nobody has sold the reforms. Nobody has sold the market. Even Deng Xiaoping, he was a dictator. He didn't have to sell anything to anyone. He used to talk all the time, selling the reforms that he was doing and the market, how it works. Because the markets, it's not intuitive to human beings. The market, I mean, how all of us working for our own profit in the bazaar, how can it all lead to the rise of the whole society? That's why Adam Smith called it an invisible hand. It's bloody invisible. Voter can't see it, the ordinary person can't see it. And therefore it needs to be explained again and again and again. So there's that one thing that needs to be.
I would possibly encourage to think about the second thing also. Why? Because on the market thing, maybe it has been roughly 30 years of reforms. Maybe this is lived experience of many that now no one is actually also talking about going back to the previous kind of agenda.
That's not true.
Okay.
They're talking about it all the time.
Yeah.
If you heard this campaign,
Yeah.
the last election.
Uh-huh. Okay. I was coming to the something second point, which I heard you started talking. And basically, you gave the framework. Everyone is thinking about his own profit in market, right? And there is one thing that we observe in case of education where CCS works. People are not allowed to work in their own interest. Do you think there could be the language of dharma to explain and communicate this to general audience?
Yeah. Well, the example of dharma was really, in a way, what Barun has been talking about, that there's a human need to feel that the state we have, the institutions we have, are institutions that work for the best, which means they are morally right, they're ethically right. That sense of every human being needs that sense of equilibrium, that what we are doing, so you sleep well at night, you know? And so I personally think that, that was Gandhi's genius, and we should remember that. And that's what, the Constitution consists of changing the habits of the heart, and that's what Dharma is all about, habits of the heart. And so, punto.
If I just add to that, habits of the heart is not or can never be through the instrument of the law. No, this is why dharma and law are distinct and different. The law is the hand of the ruler, or whatever way the ruler is, the king or the democracy, whatever, which means it comes with a stake. Dharma is driven from within. You do it because you think that's the right thing to do. Our problem is that we always think in terms of what we think is the right thing to do, and therefore try to see how the state or the government or whoever wields the danda can adopt it and run with it. That is a very big challenge, which is why, why I really think, what he just said, that this is why I think, to me, what strikes me in Gandhi is how he came to write that subtitle of his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. Because his whole life was an experiment. Till the last day he was experimenting. A living example of experimentation. In front of the whole country, all the time. To me, that is how we need to look at it. It's not we have a policy and therefore do it. In fact, what we have done is, just in case you mentioned the education question, and not just on education, on any, just think what we have done. Our first response is what? How to improve the law, right? We want to make the law better. What do we do in the process? We legitimize the danda of the law rather than the open transaction that a normal free market would have. In fact, we didn't get to this point, but one thing I really wanted to discuss, perhaps another occasion, which was this issue, that how every aspect of I already mentioned it, our own life, but how every aspect of the economy is now under the ambit of the law. Law meaning law as a danda, as a stake. Not law as in dharma, which would be morality. We really need to ask. And because there is a sharp distinction between the two. Morality and law. Morality, if it has to have any power, influence, it has to be voluntary. That's what his thing was about, being good. Law would typically come with the stake.
Perfect. I think that is where we should end this lovely, lovely conversation. Thank you very much. We planned for 1.5 hours and it has been more than 2 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you.